Hello, thank you for joining me on our webinar, Modernise Your Workplace with Microsoft Teams. My name's Simon Gammon. I'm one of the technical directors at Nexus. My areas of focus tend to be around the Office 365 and Azure stacks, and that includes Microsoft Teams, which we're going to talk about this morning. So what is Microsoft Teams? Well, probably at its most basic, Teams gives you an environment where users within your organization can collaborate with each other on a number of different levels. It is part of the Office 365 environment, so with most of the licensing that you can get with Office 365, you will find actually Teams is already part of that licensing already. I think there's just one or two licenses which are kind of at the bottom end where Teams is not included. But for most of you out there, you should already have access to this product. As far as kind of collaboration is concerned, then you've got chat conversations that you can have within Teams. So traditionally, where users would have been kind of communicating with each other via email, the chat provides a kind of instant messaging environment. The idea with context is, as you'll see later on with Teams, it isn't just one continual chat with everybody kind of putting their input in. Actually, what you'll start to do is you'll start to kind of organize the Teams environment, put a structure in place, and the conversations that will take place within that structure. So when somebody's joining in on a conversation, they've already got this kind of context of, this conversation is relating to HR, or it's relating to maybe IT support, or even a sort of project that you may be working on. Beyond the chat conversations, obviously, that you can have within Teams, you can also make calls with Teams. So kind of out of the box, everybody within the org who's kind of like using Teams, you will have the ability to make internal calls with those users. So it could be a situation where something starts off as chat and suddenly you're looking at it thinking, well, actually, this is turning into a bit of a more convoluted conversation. I'll pick up the phone. Well, with this, what you can do within Teams is you can just make that call. So a chat conversation very quickly becomes a call between two people, or even a call between a number of members of staff. And it's nice to see actually how that kind of conversation can escalate, because it could start off as a simple chat, turns into a phone call, which could be a video phone call, and then actually as you're working on something within Teams, maybe it's a document proposal, a report, maybe you want to kind of get that report up on screen so everyone can see it, while having that conversation, while doing the face-to-face with people. And with Teams, you can do all of that. Out of the box, to make voice calls internally, that's available. If you want to make external calls with Microsoft Teams, then there is an additional component that you kind of need to purchase that kind of adds on to Teams. And I think we probably talk a bit about that in another webinar. So sharing and collaborating on documents. So I mentioned this process whereby you could have a chat conversation that's kind of escalating up into a conference call, and you could be sharing documents while doing that, or you could just be working on documents. So the thing with Microsoft Teams is it gives you access to a lot of the Office 365 environment, and so that allows you to access documents that you may have within SharePoint. And so what you could be doing is kind of working on those documents, making changes, and then literally making those documents available for other people to kind of consume. It's probably just worth mentioning briefly as well is that when you work with Teams, you don't need to leave the environment at all. You can stay within Teams but access the other areas of Office 365, which is kind of bringing me on to this last point about the single pane of glass. And really the concept there is that Teams really is a product that hooks into everything in the 365 environment. So when you're working on files, well, the files aren't actually stored within Teams, they're stored in SharePoint, but you can access that information. There are other tools within the Office 365, like the Planner, for example. And again, what you can do is you can kind of integrate the Planner in, and have that available within the Teams environment. So you're not actually needing to leave the Teams client to go out and access other areas of Office 365. Something else that's quite cool as well, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on maybe, where what you can do is you can actually link your Teams into third-party components. And there's various ways that we can do that, but one of the ways that you can kind of approach that is if, say, you've got another cloud-based app you're using, presents a web page where you're interacting with that product, or you could actually bring that into Microsoft Teams as well. So yeah, the single pane of glass concept is really around the idea of you can go into Teams, you can work in Teams all day without having to necessarily jump off to all these different other applications. So some of the benefits of Microsoft Teams. Well, the first one to mention is that it's cloud-based. There is no prereq at the start that you need to install a load of infrastructure on site. As long as you have a mobile phone, a laptop, or a desktop computer with an internet connection, you can get going with Microsoft Teams. Out of the box, you don't even need to install the client. You could just access Microsoft Teams through the browser. However, for a better experience, I would recommend that you do install the client. And there's a client for all the different mobile phone platforms, and there's a client that you can install on your laptop, desktop as well. Easy to set up. So once you're kind of connected into Office 365, if you go into the web client of Teams, and what you'll get there is a option to kind of download and install the actual desktop client as well. So for users to actually get up and running, it is nice and quick. Accessible from anywhere. So again, not requiring even VPN connections. As long as the user is able to log into Office 365, the one thing I'd probably recommend there is you may want to consider having multi-factor authentication up and running, just so that users from home can kind of get connected in, but you know you've still got a good level of security there. Then yeah, being able to kind of connect to it, whether you're kind of working at home, at the office, or even out on the move. And the actual mobile app that you can use with Teams actually is pretty good. So yeah, you can just find very quickly you're jumping between a desktop and a laptop and a mobile device without really kind of giving much consideration to it. Business knowledge being more centralized. Well, what you're doing here is that this is where you start to kind of bring the knowledge of the business into the 365 environment. So as you're working on files and creating documents, those are kind of being saved through the Files tab in Microsoft Teams. As I mentioned before, actually what you're doing is you're saving it into SharePoint. But what you start to get is quite a logical structure in place. And then being able to kind of go back through that information at a later date and find answers to things then becomes that little bit easier, rather than trying to find documentation that is buried away on a network drive somewhere. Consistent interface. So Teams being part of 365, you'll kind of go into the sort of Teams environment, and again, whether you're accessing it through the browser or accessing it through the desktop client, you've just got that sort of consistent sort of experience. So when a user picks up the mobile phone, they're not having to relearn Teams. Actually, it feels very intuitive out of the box. And there are integrated apps as well. So this is where you can kind of extend what Teams is doing. So as you sort of fire Teams up for the first time, yes, you'll see various teams in place, and you may have sort of chat conversations going on, but you may want to integrate with third-party applications that you're already using. And so Teams gives you the ability to do that. And the other thing, which probably comes back to the kind of one of the benefits of being cloud-based, is Teams is under constant improvement. So with historical kind of applications, when you used to have things installed on premise, you would wait for kind of IT support to come along and say, right, we're going to run the next sort of service pack. And Microsoft's kind of release cycle on those service packs could be anywhere between sort of 3 to 6 months. So you'd get to the stage where you're looking to do an update and then possibly hold off, because actually you never want to be the first person to install a service pack. And so actually by the time you got new features, you could be kind of 8 to 12 months down the road. Microsoft are trickling in new features all the time, so there are no more kind of big bang updates. And the great thing about that is you don't need to worry about it either. So yeah, sometimes a new feature will come in and there may be a little bit of learning to see, well, okay, how can you get the benefit of that new feature? But at least you're not having to go through the pain of actually having to introduce those kind of new components. And cost, yes. So the thing again is that really, it's if you're already using Office 365, then you've already got Teams. It's part of your licensing. One of the things that Microsoft's doing as well at the moment is obviously with the whole COVID thing that's going on. They're also, if you haven't got Teams at the moment and you're looking to maybe kind of consider that, then Microsoft are offering some free licensing around that. But the intention will be is I think the licensing will run free for a period, but then you will kind of go on to a sort of paid subscription. So if you haven't already got Teams in your environment, then that's maybe a sort of low entry point that you could look at for actually getting Teams up and running. But carrying on the cost thing, is really the licensing. And I mentioned in a previous slide that if you've got 365, you've got Teams, it comes with most of the sort of licensing options, but there are one or two that it doesn't. So on this slide here, obviously we're looking at the Business Essentials, Business Premium, Business licensing. Really the only thing to highlight on this is that if you're just running Office 365 Business, then you won't get Teams out of the box. If you're running on the Essential license, okay, you won't get access to the Office apps, the desktop versions of those Office apps, but you can still access sort of Microsoft Teams. So yeah, it's got quite a low entry point to get up and running. With a lot of orgs, though, it tends to be that we end up looking around the kind of e-licensing, enterprise licensing. So again, Teams comes with the E1, E3, E5. But again, just know if you're kind of running on Pro Plus, you probably won't have access to Teams out of the box. Okay, so a little bit of information around the structure. Two terms that will come up when using the Teams environment and will pretty much be part of the kind of day-to-day sort of Teams language is obviously the concept of a team and channel. These are almost like your logical units within Microsoft Teams and will kind of form the structure of your Microsoft Teams environment. So the first one then being the team. Well, a team will represent potentially some function within your organization. So that could be a department, it could be you set up a team to represent an ad hoc working party, or even a project or something that you may be working on at the time. When you set a team up, you'll create that team, you'll give it a name, and then effectively you will invite members to that team. And normally that setup process actually is quite straightforward for most teams. You'll probably have a couple of owners. The owners will be responsible for deciding who's in and who's out of that team, and be able to control some more advanced permissions. And then everybody else will be effectively a member of that team, where they'll be able to go in and sort of use the chat, access the files within that team. So in some cases, you may set a team up and everybody in your organization will have access to it because it's kind of common and standard information. But what you may also have is a team that represents something that is you want more locked down, and so the membership is very small in that team. So it could be, I don't know, like a directors group, for example, or maybe there's elements of HR that you want to better kind of discuss within a small group, and only those people will be able to access it. So when you set those members up, only those members will be able to have access to the chat conversations, and only those members will be able to access the files within that particular team. But then the thing is say, for example, you do set a team up, that team represents a department. What you'll then find is that there'll be various topics that will kind of take place within that team. And so what you'll go on to do is set up channels. By default, every team has a channel already. So but when you go in there and you create a team, you don't have to create your first channel, it's already there. And so what you may find is with a good number of the teams you set up, maybe actually one channel is all you need. But what you can do if you need to is add other channels in there. So there may be various themes that team needs to discuss, and you want to kind of break those themes out into separate conversations, but all still accessible to members of that team. and so you can create additional channels to kind of accommodate that. And so these are the two kind of logical units, like I say, you will see all the time within Teams. And if people are kind of talking about the Microsoft Teams environment, these two terms will come up time and time again. Just something to mention about channels is that you can't add members to a channel that aren't already in a team. So by default, when you set a team up and you add a channel in, everybody who's a member of that team has access to that channel. Although recently Microsoft also introduced the idea of private channels, where you can take members of that team and then give them access to one particular channel. So it could be a subset of your membership. And yeah, that's kind of quite a useful little feature that's just come out. Okay, so in this slide then we have a view of the Teams client. What you're going to see here then is right on the left hand side some icons that allow you to sort of navigate various features of Teams. But probably more importantly, what you also see here is the actual structure, the teams and channels that we discussed earlier that we've got in place. So in this particular example here, we have our team, which is Northwind Traders. And as I mentioned before, when we set our membership up, we set our membership up at team level. And then under that team, we have a number of different channels. So looking on the right, you can see a conversation that's taking place within this team. And this particular conversation is actually taking place inside the marketing channel. So this gives us our kind of context for the conversation. Probably just the other thing just to mention here is that when you first create a team, it will have a conversation that will go with the channel, and what you'll also get is files as well, and this is up here above in the tabs. Just a quick note on files. Files are stored inside SharePoint when you work with Microsoft Teams, and when you create a team, what you'll also do is you create a SharePoint site that goes alongside that team where your files will be held. But the tabs at the top don't just have to be for conversations and files, they can be for all sorts of things. Earlier I mentioned about the fact that you could integrate Teams with third-party applications. So if you've got a web-based app that you're using day to day that's pertinent to this particular team, what you can actually do is you could create a tab at the top that that can be used to access that particular application. In the case of this example though, we've just got 4 tabs, which are the conversations, files, notes and planner. But as you kind of develop your Teams environment, it's not unusual to actually have a whole number of tabs at the top, exposing different elements of 365, again through that sort of single pane of glass experience. Okay, so what we saw on the previous slide then was the Teams client with some example teams in place. But what you can also do as well is there are going to be conversations you're going to want to have, a bit like an email, which are just between 2 people or maybe more, that are outside of the normal kind of day-to-day conversation of your team. And that's where chat comes in. It still has all the same functionality of the posts and conversations that you'll create within a team, but you can just create them just at any point in time, and you can add 1 or more people into a chat, and it enables you to have a conversation. A bit like with the team though, you can escalate that conversation up, so it could start off in a chat window, you could be sharing documents within that, you could be sharing video files, whatever, but then if you want to, you could then turn it into a video call and kind of take it to that sort of next level. So the chat really is almost just a way of having ad hoc conversations that are outside of your normal day-to-day team logic. Yep, so away from the desktop client, you've also got Teams available on the mobile. You've got a Teams client that you can use on all the common mobile platforms, also available on the iPad, and it gives you most of the functionality within Teams. So if you're on the move, you can carry on with those chat conversations, continue access and share files, access the Office 365 apps, and as I've mentioned a good few times already, that chat conversation that becomes a telephone conversation, again, you can do all of that through the mobile client. Okay, so yeah, got a couple of do's and don'ts for you really when working with Microsoft Teams. Probably the starting point is in the early days keeping it simple. There's maybe a temptation to kind of sit down when you're building your teams and try and build a team that covers every single project and every single department and all the different functions that go on within a business. But in the early days, those teams might be quite empty. You don't necessarily have to have all those teams in place on day one. If you're trying to bring users and ease users into the team's environment, what I would suggest is keeping it simple in the early days. Maybe just introduce some top level teams that allow people to kind of navigate kind of key functions within the business. As time goes on, you can evolve it. You know, you're not working in an environment where it's set up and then you can't do anything else with it. You can introduce teams as you go along. One of the advantages of doing that is that you can learn from what's going on. If you just create loads of teams on day one, what you can end up finding is you end up with a whole pile of teams that will just never get used by the users. Whereas if you evolve your team's environment, then at least what you're doing is you're adding teams in as users are kind of needing it. And then kind of the granularity of teams. So the thing about teams is there isn't one method that fits all, and there isn't maybe one way of approaching teams that you do within your own environment that you've got to stick to. And by this, the example I've got on this slide is where maybe you've got a number of different projects that you want to have different teams for. Well, you kind of need to ask yourself the question, do you need 5 different teams for 5 different projects, or actually could you do it with one team? Remember, teams have channels as well, so if you've got one team with a number of different channels within it, then maybe that's a better way to go because they can all share the same files tab. But saying that, you'll get projects that will come along, or departments, or whatever the kind of thing you're creating the team for, where it does need its own dedicated team. So the kind of do here is you can do both. It's not set in stone. Okay, so don'ts. Probably the most critical thing I can mention in all of these slides is not to let users go off and start creating their own teams. It's tempting because actually sometimes you could take the view that, well, you know, users might know best on what they want as a team structure, but the big risk that you run with this is that you could end up creating chaos in your team's environment. Loads and loads of teams get created, they're only ever used by 1 or 2 people and then get quickly abandoned, and then what you end up with is something with which looks a bit of a mess. The problem then is that someone's got to go back later on and try and tidy all that up. So as a recommendation here, a big don't let users create teams. Control that process. If users want to have teams, then have a process by which they can create that, have people who can set the teams up. But certainly in the early days, and I would probably say ever, control that process. As I say, trying to unpick a team's environment that people have gone into and just gone mental on, it can that can be quite painful. And probably it's the opposite of the do I've already said, actually, which is maybe not creating too many teams on day one. Again, in the early days, your team's environment could be quite empty. There aren't going to be lots of conversations in there. So draw people in, just create the teams that you need in the early days. You can always add more. So some takeaways then from today's webinar. Remember, keep it simple. You can keep building teams as you go along. You don't need everything in place on day one. Try and just draw users in. You can add more channels later. You can add more tabs for extra complexity later. But if you're just bringing users in for the first time, don't overwhelm them. Remember that you can evolve your use of teams. So what may be your logic today, you may want to change tomorrow. Also look at how your team site's being used. Don't just set it up and then just leave people to get on with it. It is actually worth periodically just looking back through some of your teams, asking yourself the question, actually, is that team actually getting any use? If you've got teams out there that are just not being used at all, maybe you could sort of quietly retire those off and kind of just move your files into one of your other team sites. But most importantly of all, just remember, when you're working with teams, you're not pouring concrete. You can change, you can evolve, and you can work it to make it an amazing experience for your users. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and that's me done.